It is now my pleasure to introduce the next panel, which is leveraging natural assets to promote rural prosperity. So I'd like to invite Rob and Aaron up to the front of the room. And while they make their way up here, I'll just provide a brief introduction. Rob Riley is the president of the Northern Forest Center, and Aaron Wolf is, among many other things, as I understand it, the developer of the Elizabethtown Bike Ranch in Elizabethtown, New York. And I'll let them tell you more about themselves and their organizations, because I'm sure they can do a better job than I, and I'm excited to listen to what they have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great, thanks so much. Do we have a clicker? Great. Well, Aaron,
Can
welcome.
you click for me?
We're going to click away.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
You have to figure it out first.
I do a test click. Forward, backward. Okay. Good afternoon, Andrew. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having us here today. I'm actually in from New Hampshire as of this morning, so riding down, what were we on, Broadway was quite an adventure, and a good way to get...
On city bikes.
On city bikes, yeah. A great way to arrive almost on time. So great to be here with you all, and for those of you on Zoom or whatever the platform is, thanks for joining us from wherever you all are. Again, I'm Rob Riley. I'm the president of the Northern Forest Center, and I'm pleased to be here today with Aaron, who was already introduced. But really our goal today is to share our passion for the Northern Forest, its people, its communities, and leave you with some thoughts on securing rural prosperity. I think Andrew did a great job with obviously 600 pages of great information and boiling that down. And I think what our job today is to reiterate some of those elements and give you some grounded experiences in those. Before we dive in, I want us to do a quick little exercise, and I'm sorry for this, but for those of you out in the virtual space, maybe you can stop what you're doing for a moment. Those of you who are here in the room can kind of just take a little visual exercise. You can close your eyes and keep your eyes open, whatever you want to do. I just want you to think about yourself in the country. What does that evoke to you? What do you see and what do you hear? What do you taste when you're there? Might be pollen this time of year. Are you there with others? Are you alone? Is this a place you know deeply? Is this where your people are from and where you find deep connection to? Or is this the first time you've been in that space? What does it feel like? For lots of people, for us, it feels like home. For other people, it feels like it could be some very alien experience. But I think what we really want to make sure that you understand is that the notion of country, of rural places, small towns, they evoke lots of strong feelings and emotions from lots of different people. People feel very strongly about what the country is, what rural places are, as we do. And that brings a lot of passion to these conversations. Regardless, as Andrew pointed out, the rural places is not a monolith. We need to provide different approaches to this, nor are the inhabitants therein of one political persuasion or occupy one kind of vocation. They don't always, contrary to popular belief around Vermont, they don't all drive Subarus, wear flannels, look for kale, or shop at Dollar Generals. But in our case, it's not about traditional till agriculture either. We have, by our name, the Northern Forest, we have a lot of trees. However, the context, the land, really shapes our conversation around what place is. It shapes who we are. And it really has shaped, as a result, the economic basis, the social dynamics of the places in rural that we occupy and that we all work in. And that land, I'll posit, is given greater importance today than it was 150 years ago when we were looking at, or 200 years ago when Europeans were looking at colonizing and settling. I appreciate the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve Board for hosting this important conversation. And what I want to do is actually just jump into a very quick, behind my slides, an oversimplified story of place. This map behind me is the Northern Forest. It is the largest intact forest east of the Mississippi, I'll mention. 26 million acres of contiguous forest land, an ecological and economic region stretching from, in the west, the New York Tug Hill Plateau through the Adirondacks, Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, New Hampshire's North Country, and the North Maine Woods. They all have their own personalities and names. It's a vast landscape abundant in forest, water, vistas, tradition, and for one measure of scale, if you were to walk or bike from one end of the region to the other for 8 hours a day, the 650-mile journey would take you 27 days. So just for a sense of scale. And while we think about this being very rural, this is, as we sit here in New York City, this is the great backyard of the city. And it's vastly different population density, but there are 2 million people living across this 26 million acre forest land, living in hundreds of communities. So the history, very briefly, this is actually as you can see in the bottom of the slide, the Millinocket mill yard of, 21 million logs sitting in that log yard. The region has been evolving economically for hundreds of years. Industrious people are credited with taming the wilderness. Not something we look at
Necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily a good thing. They displaced indigenous people, accessed seemingly endless timber, limitless cheap water power, and insatiable markets. They drove growth and built astonishing wealth along the eastern seaboard. And what's really important here to think about, and Andrew mentioned this in the one company towns, people in these communities had a job for life. You graduated from high school, you crossed the street, you went to the mill, you had a very good middle-class job for life. It's also a place where many took to adventure, health, and retreat. People were called to it through their romantic notions. I would call this propaganda. I've not seen this mountain.
Is that New Hampshire?
Yeah, somewhere between the Adirondacks and New Hampshire.
It's the
in someone's mind. But it was, the notions of the romance of the North Country was really reflected both in writing and in oils. And in these, it really was promoting the notion of conquering, consuming, and commercializing. Conquering, consuming, and commercializing. That is how this landscape was always looked at. So in more recent history, economic globalization, Andrew touched on these, corporate consolidation, exploitive land management, environmental and tax law changes, divergent politics, and consumer tastes all contributed to the decline of what was the economic boon that generations understood in these communities. Generations of young people then left, particularly those that were considered successful. A sign of success was leaving your community. Imagine that. You succeed if you get out of town and don't come back. And these communities were hollowing out. People left seeking jobs and careers elsewhere. 2 cities, I'll just mention 2 cities at the time, Millinocket, Maine, known as the Magic City, and Berlin, New Hampshire, known as the city that trees built, now are 50% the size of what they were within the same infrastructure. So think about losing 1 of every 2 people in your community. Throughout this decline, traditional rural economic development approaches were applied, responding to the erosion of community-based economies, commodity-based economies, by focusing on business attraction. A top-down model that uses jobs created or retained as the primary measure of success. This approach essentially sought to recreate the one mill town that had brought finite prosperity to communities in the past, and as we know, hasn't and doesn't achieve the lasting community health, the resiliency, and wealth-generating goals necessary for long-term benefit in communities. We kept losing people because other communities were better equipped to be competitive for what they needed for their hearts and minds and their economic future. But I don't want this story to be just about demise and collapse. This really is about evolution of our human relation to land and how we derive community and economic well-being in a markedly different world when then these towns grew up out of the wilderness. So a slight commercial. For the Northern Forest Center, the organization that I have the privilege of working with, we were launched 25 years ago to help create thriving and welcoming Northern Forest region sustained by innovation and environmental stewardship. Our 3-part strategy really comes as we deliver this through being a regional innovation and investment partner, what the Aspen Institute calls rural development hubs, where we're creating bold possibilities that give rise to vibrant northern forest communities. Our programs are deployed at multiple levels, but essentially within these 3 different areas at the town, state, and regional levels, again, echoing Andrew, to create forest-based businesses. Oh, my slide is a little messy there, sorry. Strengthen rural communities and deepen forest stewardship. It's the integrated nature of how these 3 interplay with each other that are almost as important or more important than each of those in individuality. And as we engage community leaders to advance new ideas that are centered on leveraging natural assets in each area, along with the skills and expertise and passion of local people, we are guided by values and beliefs that include 5 pillars. 1, we believe in the new forest future. We invest in people and communities to secure regional prosperity and a resilient landscape. 2, we believe in bold and adaptive leadership. We bring new ideas and forms of capital to accelerate innovation across geographic, social, and ideological boundaries. 3, we believe in fostering welcoming and inclusive communities. We engage diverse perspectives to generate creative solutions and help prepare the Northern Forest for a changing world. 4, we believe in widely shared opportunity, so collaborating to secure community benefits rooted in the interdependence of a vibrant economy, healthy ecosystem, and an equitable society. And 5, we believe in persistence. This does not happen overnight. It does not happen in 1 year. It does not happen in 5 years. We're on a generational turnaround here. We believe in building long-term partnerships and local capacity to sustain community pride, purpose, and vitality. And I assert that these values are the foundation that supports a new framework to rural prosperity. It's almost less about the tools that we apply and more about the approach. So across the 4-state region, we hold many tensions, and this is good. We connect rural and urban areas. We connect issues that relate to climate change. We connect corporate consolidation, demographic trends, scale, political polarization. We align community investments with business development, land stewardship with broadband and infrastructure development, and flexible capital and lasting capacity to meet the needs and financial terms of the local market. And I need to stress this one point here, this notion that, again, that Andrew brought up. I'm going to forget it here momentarily. It's the specificity of the location. When we look at the capital needs of local markets, these do not equal what market returns look like. We're talking about apples and oranges here. Local returns in rural communities mean the context of that market and what that return may be for that community. What is a false construct is when we compare community returns to market returns. And I use air quotations with market returns. So when we look at how we are now, the organization of the Northern Forest, and are applying this framework and bringing impact investment and other capital to bear, we are looking at long-term, flexible, and integrated investments in constructing middle-income housing, redeveloping downtown mixed-use buildings, expanding broadband, developing recreational trails and assets, supporting forest-based businesses, creating community-owned forests, and many, many more. Ultimately, to provide amenities that provide young people the hollowing out demographic of what they need and want to prosper. And those are the people that we want to come back, who are looking at both for providing for their community and stewarding the landscape. We essentially, as an organization, are bringing and building capacity in local institutions for the long term. It's through this approach that we help create our own exit strategy and support communities to be more competitive, providing young people who leave with something to return to. If I haven't been clear enough, I'll lay it out, the contrast in our new approach to secure rural prosperity. This is the town of Millinocket, Maine. It was one of the profiles and case studies that was in the book that Andrew referenced. Sits in the heart of Maine. That's Katahdin in the background, end of the Appalachian Trail, 2.5 million acres of forest out its back door. We as an organization are not chasing businesses. We're fostering places where people want to live and supporting the broader ecosystem to support business development. This is the real shift in our framework to foster community-based economic recovery and resilience. And I want to leave you with a lasting thought here as we think again about the exercise, the brief exercise that had you envision your rural place at the very beginning. You drive through places, you see what you see. Could be positive, could be negative, could be relating to you, could be foreign. Regardless, but more than any direct investment we can make, the shift in community psyche, the coffee shop talk, from anger, frustration, and despair. So the downside that comes with economic challenges, again, anger, frustration, despair, shifting that psyche to hope, pride, and optimism. That is a critical element in making our communities attractive to young families and workers. If we don't succeed in that element, then everything else is pushing a rope uphill. So as we shift to upstate New York and Aaron's sort of narrowing in on Elizabethtown, I really just want to talk about the last piece, which is really about shifting again that outlook and focus that builds bridges throughout the community, creating opportunity and momentum. We're really privileged to be working in a dozen communities, as you saw on the map, one of them being Elizabethtown. I consider Aaron a friend and a colleague in this work. I would say we're figuring it out as we go, and we appreciate being here to share our experiences with you. Aaron.
Thank you, Rob. Well, I'm really grateful for both of you kind of teeing up my much more informal, much more anecdotal talk about Elizabethtown. I looked at your professionally produced slides, and I just started thinking like, wow, mine's going to look like a family slideshow, which in fact it is, because that's what small town is like. What I really am excited about more than anything is this idea that, and you really first taught me about this idea that community development leading economic development and not the other way around. Elizabethtown and other towns and neighboring communities had experience with the reverse, the chasing businesses that you referred to, investing a lot of very limited local resources in building out industrial parks for businesses that never came, promising tax breaks for businesses that did come and then leave. What happened in Elizabethtown in the wake of that was very organic, very unplanned, very, very bottom up. So as I begin to kind of reflect on that idea, economic development following kind of community development, what I'm really talking about is not anybody coming and developing our community. I'm talking about really the social kind of cohesion that began to happen in E-Town about 10 or 15 years ago, and it began to happen really around recreation. So Rob and I have talked a lot about recreation-based development, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about my town that way. I'm certainly more qualified to talk about E-Town in terms of social cohesion than I am about economic development on a global level. So just to go back to the previous slide, when I looked at Rob's slides before, I thought, look at all those beautiful New England towns nestled in these little forests. Our town doesn't look like that. And then the first slide I found was this. It's a little bit low resolution, but this is taken from a promontory in a 900-acre town-owned park and trail system, which was really used very little until about 10 years ago. But it was a philanthropic gift by a wealthy landowner who left it to the town. And it turns out to be one of the most prescient things that this person could have ever endowed to his community. If you go to the next town, E-Town, has a kind of old-fashioned, and I'll use E-Town as a shorthand for Elizabethtown. E-Town has a kind of old-fashioned sense of itself, and it always had. That buggy, weirdly enough, is kind of the de facto logo for our community. And I never really thought too much about that buggy, except it seemed kind of hokey and old-fashioned. I think it referred to the buggies that used to run the train from New York City to Montreal, stops in Westport, New York, and then buggies would go from Westport to E-Town. I think it may also be the fact that, sadly, E-Town's time of greatest thriving was in the buggy era. So maybe somehow we hold on to that image of buggies. But what I like about the buggy, and why I kind of want to, maybe repurpose that logo in a sort of modernist buggy interpretation, is, if you go to the next slide, what the buggy connotes to me is that Elizabethtown, like so many other towns in the northern forest, was built in a pre-automotive era. And just as prescient as that gift of the blueberry trails to our town was by that one donor, the people that built these villages probably could not have anticipated the fact that the fastest growing real estate prices in the country are in walkable and bikeable communities, and that these rural communities, and we're here to discuss rural communities, really have urban cores, even very small ones like mine. So one of the notable businesses, Rob talked earlier about the sort of coffee shop talk to gauge the mood of the community. That happens here in this building, which is the last remaining structure of the Deer's Head Inn, which used to have that and that and that and that. Elizabethtown, we talked about extractive economies. You talked about resource commodity-based economies. Elizabethtown is sandwiched between the Champlain Valley and the High Peaks. Elizabethtown has this kind of in-betweenness about it in lots of ways. It historically was in between two communities that focus on extractive resources. Lewis, the town of Lewis, which had over half a dozen sawmills, and to the north and to the south, the town of Mariah, which had the biggest single iron ore deposit in the US until the mines of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan were discovered. So E-Town was always kind of this in-between place, but it did at one point have 500 hotel rooms. The Deer's Head had 160 hotel rooms. Today, the Deer's Head has 6 hotel rooms left. But it is still a kind of gathering place, and when I was a kid, it was the only place that seemed to kind of break through a lot of the cleavages that existed in our society between seasonal people, between year-round people, between more affluent people, between less affluent people. Even if you only went there on prom night or for a Kiwanis meeting, it was the one place where people from all these different groups came, and it still kind of is that today. It's a gathering place. It's a great place to gauge what's going on in town. It features a lot of local food produced by some of those Champlain Valley growers. And it also features my daughter, Eloise, playing bass in the house band. It is a place where you really can gauge the mood of the community, and it's the place where I began to sense that the mood of the community was changing. And I think it was changing a lot because you talked about communities that measure their success by number of jobs. Well, we measure our success by school enrollment. That is the one thing you can walk into any town in northern New York and ask about or talk about, and everyone will think that that is the one statistic by which we can measure our success or our failures. E-Town's still losing school enrollment. We've just consolidated with Westport, a neighboring town. But that trend seems to be slowing. And there are very evident new families moving to town, and they come to the Deer's Head, and that's where they're seen by everybody else who starts talking about them. In addition to playing bass, my daughter also has another badass attribute, which is she's part of a biker gang. And this biker gang is really emblematic of that change in heart and that change in mood. This group has a name, and the name of this group is the X-Chromes. It was started by 12 fathers, myself included, who all had daughters of about the same age. And so Eloise and her friends and us started wanting to hang out on these mountain bike trails. We had been building mountain bike trails with our wives and partners and families and friends for about 5 years before this whole thing started about 5 years ago. And the trails were built very spontaneously. Elizabethtown has the luck of having great kind of terrain for mountain bikes, which means not too steep or radical. It has a lot of private land on which those trails could be built without too much bureaucratic steps. So because of that, we started building trails because we built trails. We started going out on the trails with our families. Because we started going out on the trails with our families, we started meeting other young families that came to town and thought, this is pretty cool. This is how informal and spontaneous a lot of stuff that's happened in E-Town is. And when we were on the trails, we started trying to come up with events that would mostly happen in the shoulder seasons, which are tough times in the northern forest, that would be kind of inclusive of the kind of people, unlike, say, the Iron Man in Lake Placid or tourist-oriented events. We started making events for us, just like we built trails for us. Our road race is only a 1-mile road race, and most of us can make it a mile. And our hockey tournament, our pond hockey tournament, which inexplicably has colonial and disco themes to it every year, is designed so that, this is a plan we came up with this year, that next year, to make it more inclusive, the less skating ability you have, the more your goals count. So we had semi-pro players who came down from Burlington to play, and then we had, never-evers, 6-year-olds, and we're going to now incentivize that you have to pass to the 6-year-olds. If they put it in the net, it's worth 3 points as opposed to everyone else. It sounds a little like Pollyanna-ish, but that's what happens in our community. But the biggest event of the year is the E-Town Beatdown, which is this brutal mountain bike race that attempts to ride every trail. And every trail now means just about, in our community, 2,900 acres of trails have been built out by the community. So the people that started this race, and it's funny when you see 4th annual, when we started these events a few years ago, we called them First Annual, which is really kind of a commitment to make, because then all of a sudden you have to make them every year. The founders of this particular event not only founded this event, though, and helped build a lot of the trails, but started a mountain bike manufacturing company. And this is a really significant component of our work in E-Town. It's called Solace Cycles, which is exactly the feeling that you don't feel when you're driving down one of our trails on one of those bikes. There's nothing solace about it. But they decided to build a purpose-built Adirondack climber, a mountain bike that was really designed, it was like the sort of bike equivalent of terroir in food. It is a bike that's designed to climb the kind of trails we have, which are rooty and rocky and not so flowy like the ones in the rest of New England or out west.
You gotta ride more.
Anyway, just a little regional dig. But it seemed axiomatic to a lot of us for a long time that we should be testing and building and developing and manufacturing the kind of equipment that we recreate with, where we recreate with it, in our towns. And so for all our efforts to try to attract light manufacturing in other ways, this is an example of light manufacturing coming to be in a very organic way, consistent with the kinds of things we were doing to have fun. The person who developed them also took over what used to be a privately owned ski hill just outside of our town. You have to work out your arms as much as your legs. It's free to everyone, and it only opens when it's snow, when there's snow, and you have to simply agree not to sue the owners, and you can ski for free. This is the kind of thing that I think can only happen, or has, I don't want to say can only happen, but it has happened because our town is the scale it is. When you go there, you know everyone, or you know someone who knows someone. How's my time? Okay, good. So, I brought up Otis also, though, to talk a little bit about the geography of this development, because what I really want to get to is how some of this informal social stuff began to translate into actual economics. So here is Otis, down here. There's Blueberry, where I talked about that first shot was taken from Blueberry. About 5 years ago, that blue little piece of land there that says Bike Ranch came up for sale, or at least half of it did. And we knew just by looking at the map that that was a special piece of property. We knew because it was between this 900-acre Blueberry Hill Trail system and the Hurricane Wilderness, which is spelled Hero-cane, strangely enough, on that slide, which is a 23,000-acre publicly owned wilderness tract. We knew also from looking at the map that it was probably about 2,000 feet of elevation, which is about 1,500 feet higher than the town of Elizabethtown. And yet, none of us, even those of us who had grown up in our town, had any idea what was up there. There was a 3-mile Jeep trail to get up there. And this is what we found when we got there. An incredible meadow down here, about a 2-acre meadow. It was looked like a UFO landing site. This incredible cliff, this kind of Western scale vista, and hardly anything visible of evidence of human life there. It just blew our minds. And we went up there and we saw the meadow down below. And those are the cliffs that you were just standing on top of. And we hatched an idea. And the idea was that we should develop this property and do it in a way, just like at Otis Mountain in that last slide, that brought visitors and residents together. What was clearly emerging in this mountain bike world was that the people who came to visit our town, it wasn't like what was going on in Lake Placid. It wasn't what happened in tourist towns where, we would make their bed and serve them a meal, and if we were lucky, they would leave a tip on the table, and the only way we knew what their names were was from the credit card slips. Weirdly, with mountain biking, people came and not only did they want to ride with us, which was weird and interesting, but they would want to hang out afterwards. So we thought, why don't we try to make a place for that to happen in this incredible, incredible area? And the idea was that we would create a kind of a village around that meadow that sort of aped the scale of village in our town. And we would make the trails and the facilities open and free to the public, but visitors that lodged there would pay. We would also see if we could raise the money in the community, and we went to our community members, mostly bikers and their families, and said, we want to raise a certain amount of money. It turned out to be about $500,000, and we want to know if we should create a nonprofit that does this, and you would get a tax deduction, or would you like to be an owner? And everyone, 49-1 was the vote, we want to be owners. So we ended up creating a B corporation. We filed all the paperwork with the SEC to be able to take non-accredited investors and sell shares to small dollar investors in the community. And now the Elizabethtown Bike Ranch, a little bit delayed by the pandemic, is breaking ground this summer. There's a pavilion, there's a bathhouse, there's a 4-season cross-country ski base, and there's the bathhouse, there's showers that you can use if you're in the community. There's a hotel check-in if you're staying there as a lodger. And the idea is that this is going to be the first of its kind of pedal-in, off-the-grid wilderness lodge and trail system. While we were waiting to get the permits, we began to build out the trails. Here's some folks in our town building out the trails. And we began to think a lot more about, here's another asset for our community, but it's off in the woods. How can we begin to make those assets not only visible, but not only connected to the community, but visible? So I began to collaborate with Rob and some others on a grant that we got from the Northern Border Regional Commission to build this connector trail, to build a trail center on the golf course, and to begin to integrate the mountain bike trails with the commerce in our downtown so that there could be, if somebody comes to ride in the town, maybe they'll come and patronize some of the businesses. We started looking at the businesses that were there, And that led to an interesting project. This is the former Baptist church is now the town hall. And this used to be the Valley Pharmacy when I was a kid. It was built in the 1870s. It had that nice porch on it. Go back. And, okay, now you can go forward. And this is what it looks like today. The Valley Pharmacy is no longer a pharmacy. Kinney's bought it out, which is a regional chain. And what's interesting is that in 1870, it used to be a soda fountain, like so many pharmacies in the North Country, and it used to be a candy shop and a public gathering place. So the plan that we came up with is to, and somehow, and when Kinney's bought it, it put these funky gables on. So the idea is to get rid of the gables and make a kind of a soda fountain, which will probably be the form of, on one hand, a cidery. On another hand, we're starting a carbonated seltzer company with Adirondack essences like spruce and wild grape, stuff we forage. And we're getting the water from the bike ranch, where we put in a well above all the rest of civilization at 2,000 feet that produces 50 gallons a minute. To put that in context, the town of Lewis's well pulls 25 gallons a minute. So incredibly clean water, incredibly trendy idea, and yet revitalizing this kind of 1870s idea. So this has broken ground now too, in the sense that we keep breaking more and more ground to find a place to have a safe foundation, and we haven't quite found that yet. But you know, as I dig deeper and spend more money on this than I'd hoped to, I do keep thinking of the way these economies have come to be. They do take time. They are not capricious. They're built on a solid community. And it's interesting to see that in my context of my talk today, when we talk about investment, we've talked about private philanthropy, the guy who left the blueberry trails to the town. We've talked about informal philanthropy, my friend Jeff, that opens Otis Mountain for free. We've talked about, you know, private investment in the form of building a bike company here. We've talked about community investment in the bike ranch. And here's another example of private investment. So all this kind of economic activity has grown, and this diverse economic activity has grown out of these projects. I want to point out too that at the hockey rink, part of our investment has been in having free hockey skates that Jeff, the owner of Otis Mountain, sharpens every year at the beginning of the year. The bikes, we've created an informal bike lending library so that as these girls get older, and it still is mostly girls, they pass them on to the next generation regardless of the resources that generation has available. I can't talk about, whoa, yes, this is the bike that I'm inheriting here with. I can't talk, you know, about every town, but I can say that what's happened in our town is very organic. We need a lot of help. We need a lot of investment in ways that we don't have the skills always to do. We don't have sewage treatment in our town, which is a major impediment to further development. We don't have housing, but we're addressing the office space shortage. We have in a town of 1,200 people, we have 200 people that work in the county buildings and the hospital, and 60% of them live in other towns. So when we talk about how we would collaborate with outside investors, we have a lot of really good ideas of what we can do. But I think we can back up those ideas with what we have done and how this stuff has come to be in a very spontaneous and organic way.
So I believe we have 5 minutes if people have any questions, or I can ask you a question too.
You have to go up to the mic.
Okay. Okay, no questions in the room. I'll just say, you touched on this, Aaron, but I think it's one thing that we are doing similarly is how do we bring new forms of capital that are not beholden to traditional underwriting criteria, credit check, things like that, for the type of projects like the bike ranch, in-town redevelopment. You talked about it being from the community, and I guess I'm curious as to how you think we can get more traditional institutions engaged in that form of investment. I'll share one example from our perspective is that local hospital is investing in a fund that we have for building redevelopment in a town that they're occupied in. But when you think about engaging other institutions in would be the church or others in the community, what do you think are the best ways of doing so?
Well, first of all, I wanted to go back to one of the things that Andrew presented, which was the ways that credit scores in the Lakota community didn't necessarily correspond with traditional metrics. And my first thought, as it always is, because I'm such a civic booster and partisan, is what is it in Elizabethtown? How can investment prospects in Elizabethtown be measured in a way that makes that kind of support more favorable? I loved the idea of time in one job as being a more telling metric than some of those traditional metrics. And I asked myself how in E-Town, I would say participation in the X-Chromes makes a very reliable loan, but I don't know how you show that to a loan officer. Those dads show up over and over again. And I think that I've heard a lot of crazy and interesting things. There are people that are mining crypto with renewable power on some of the mills that still live with a focus on the community. There are other creative ideas, such as some of the stuff that you've developed in terms of creating a housing fund, an investment vehicle to build housing. Yep.
Sure.
Terrific.
Hi, I teach at a local community college in the New York City area, and we know that the pandemic has created tremendous challenges for the world. How has technology impacted the growth of your town? For example, we can reach people now via Zoom, having conversations. Has it had an impact on you in your town?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think that education and technology are two pretty significant systems. I know technology we will discuss a little later. Give one example of a school district in a community we've worked closely with, and 60% of the students who went to that school did not have home internet capability. So the sheer fact of internet connectivity was an inability for homeschooling when the pandemic hit. Secondarily, what we saw is a lot of individuals from urban areas finding safety in rural places. And those homes that had internet access were the first ones to be purchased. And cash offer usually above asking price. So essentially we saw that those places that had broadband were scooped up by second homeowners or speculative homeowners. Those who didn't have broadband, particularly school kids, we actually did a workaround where we bought wireless laptops for, I think it was 130 kids before the state could come in. So we had to do quick workarounds to allow that to happen, but it is a continual challenge of that infrastructure that many of us take for granted in more urban places. You got a mountain in the way, cellular doesn't work. You got a lot of roads to cover with broadband. The geography and the commercialization of it is not advantageous. I would say we did rural electrification in the 40s as a public investment. The administration and prior administration have tried to push public money out into broadband, but our work has really been to help build capacity in local communities and groups of communities to absorb some of that federal money. It's a multi-layered challenge, I think, is the short answer to your good question that will persist for quite some time.
Thank you, guys. A colleague of mine talks about the role of the charismatic super genius in getting things like this started. And I grew up in a town of around 500 in Ohio, and it is not done particularly well. And so I was curious, and yet your story, if I understood it, felt like there were a lot of different individuals engaged. Do you feel like that was happenstance? Is this replicable? Are there things that towns need to be thinking about? Was the local government playing a role, for example? Or did it really, I was just curious, the replicability of it, and whether, is the lightning going to strike more than once? And it clearly did in Elizabethtown.
Yeah, why don't you do this from your community, and I'll do one other quick thing. I know we've got to move on.
I think that's a really great question. And I have to say that there's one person who's been involved in pretty much everything I described, except for the dads, is this fellow, Jeff Allett, who graduated first in his class from Elizabethtown High School, went away, studied engineering, came back, started a composite company against all odds that succeeded in a neighboring town, sold the business, and has since been kind of being that super charismatic person. He's on the town board now. He's the guy that opens the ski hill for free for everyone. There's no question that he and several other kind of larger-than-life personalities have been catalysts. But it's kind of a chicken and an egg question, isn't it? Was there something about this town and its community that gave rise to those characters? Or did those characters help give rise to the community? I don't know if it's replicatable, but I think that just the way that we seek to thoughtfully diversify educational institutions by going out and recruiting people that will bring diversity to our educational experience, that will bring kind of, a different angle. When an Ivy League school goes to a small town in New Hampshire and looks for somebody who may not have the same education as a prep school kid, who may not even be the valedictorian, but brings something special. I wonder if in the context of rural development, because it is so often true that there are those super catalysts, I wonder if maybe in your work, we could be kind of scouting for who those people might be, and maybe they're just under-resourced, or maybe they haven't had a platform in which to flourish, as you say.
Very quickly, I know we need to move on. One thing I would say is that, and this may be very provocative, but not all rural places are created equal. If we looked at the communities that we shared, the high natural resources and amenities that can be provided there do attract a certain type of people. And if we have one charismatic super genius, if we have only one in a community, then I think we're doomed to fail. I think we have multiple of them, then we have a better odds on winning out. And I would say that we have sort of two ways in which we look at identifying focal communities that have an opportunity upside factor. And there's, education, healthcare, all these different sort of nuts and bolts. But if you don't have leadership, momentum, different forms of capital, it's not going to go. It is very much about pushing rope uphill. So yes, you do need those leaders, but I really would say that they are ones that are very selfless. Jeff would be the one that I would say are not looking out for their returns, they're looking out for community returns. So it's what the emphasis of that superpower is being directed in, I think.
I just want to add a little bit, because you said you're from Ohio, and you said that our communities have this incredible endowment of natural resources, clean water, mountains, forests, above all. I spent a lot of time in rural Iowa because as my capacity as a documentary journalist. And I'm amazed at the recreation booms that are flourishing there in gravel biking, in rock climbing. I spent a bunch of time in Belmont County, Ohio also, and was amazed to see mountain biking thriving there. Mountain biking is thriving in some of the less glamorous outdoor destinations, West Virginia, Upper Peninsula, Eastern Oregon. So yes, place specific, yes, derived from place, but in the realm of recreation, it's really happening everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you.